Camp Carroll, South Korea, 1978. Steve House is in the cab of a bulldozer, waiting for his next order. He's 20 years old, an Army heavy equipment operator, and his job that morning is simple. Dig a trench the length of a city block. That's it. In the Army, you dig the trench. The drums start coming out of a warehouse the soldiers have their own name for. They call it Voodoo Land because of the chemical smell that hangs around the place and because nobody's allowed to ask what's stored inside. The drums arrive on forklifts, army green with yellow and orange markings. Some of them are already seeping through the rusted walls. When House climbs down to look at one up close, he can read the label from 3 feet away. Province of Vietnam, compound orange. At 20 years old, he doesn't fully understand what he's reading. He climbs back up and buries them, hundreds of drums, over several months. Then he says nothing about it for 33 years. He'll come back to it, but first, let's back up. Because what Steve House buried at Camp Carroll is just the final scene of a story that starts a decade earlier, in a country America was technically no longer at war with. A story spanning 2 countries, tens of thousands of veterans, and 60 years of a government pretending not to understand what it had done. Most people think the Korean War ended in 1953. Technically, it did, on paper. A ceasefire. The guns went quiet, and the men who were still alive came home. What most people don't know is that starting in 1966, North Korea launched a deliberate campaign of infiltration and violence that made the DMZ one of the most dangerous stretches of ground in the world to wear an American uniform. Hundreds of attackers over 3 years, ambushes, tunnels, sappers, assassination teams. In 1967 alone, the 2nd Infantry Division sector saw 150 documented combat incidents, and 16 American soldiers were killed in firefights that never appeared in any national casualty count. Then January 1968, 31 North Korean commandos cut through the fence line and fought their way to within 100 meters of the South Korean president's residence in Seoul before a police checkpoint stopped them. 4 Americans died in the engagements that followed. 2 days later, North Korea seized the USS Pueblo, a Navy intelligence ship, and held its entire crew captive for nearly a year. If you served along that border during those years, you weren't in a peacekeeping mission. You were in a hot shooting war that your government had decided not to call one. The Army made that acknowledgement indirectly. On April 1, 1968, the Department of Defense declared the DMZ and Imjin River area a hostile fire zone and started paying combat wages to the men stationed there. Combat infantryman badges were awarded on that border. American soldiers died earning them. By the time things quieted down in the early 1970s, the U.S. had taken 82 killed in action in Korea since the 1953 ceasefire. Men whose names don't appear in the Vietnam casualty figures, whose service rarely gets counted anywhere. In April 1968, the same month hostile fire pay started, the Army began spraying herbicides along the southern side of the DMZ. The operational reason was visibility. The hills south of the fence were covered in dense Korean scrub forest, the kind of ground cover that makes a patrol genuinely blind from 10 feet out. Perfect terrain for infiltrators who moved at night and already knew every trail. If you could strip it, you could see. If you could see, you had a fighting chance. The operation ran from April 1968 through July 1969, across a strip of land 151 miles long and up to 350 yards wide from the fence line south to the civilian control line. By the time it was finished, they'd used 59,000 gallons of chemicals to defoliate nearly 21,000 acres of Korean terrain. Among those chemicals was Agent Orange. The men of the 2nd Infantry Division and elements of the 7th patrolled that ground every day. About 4,000 American soldiers were in or near that cleared strip at any given time. They ran their routes through it. They set up observation posts inside it. They worked in terrain that had been soaked in herbicide, and nobody told them what had been used, what to avoid, or what might happen to them years down the road. Think about what that hillside looked like. Korean hills in spring are dense and green and alive with sound. Wind through leaves, birds, the noise of living things. That strip was silent, brown and flat. The root systems dying in the ground. The color wrong, something stripped away that should have been there. The soldiers knew something had been done to it. What they didn't know was that the same thing was being done to them. Years later, the men who'd walked that strip started getting sick. The same diagnoses appearing over and over in veterans from the same units, the same stretch of hillside. When they went to the VA, they were told what Vietnam veterans had been told for years before the connection was finally acknowledged there. Prove it. And to prove it, they'd need documents that were still classified. The Army had those documents, kept them classified, and said nothing to the men on the ground. 2,000 miles to the south, a quieter version of the same mistake was already underway. Thailand was the Air Force's backstage during the Vietnam War, the part of the operation the public wasn't watching, where a massive American military presence ran largely out of sight. 7 major bases hosted tens of thousands of American service members cycling through on tours of duty. Udorn, Takli, Korat, Utapao, Uban, Nakhon Phanom, Don Muang. From these installations, U.S. aircraft flew strike missions over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Intelligence operations ran around the clock. The logistics pipeline that fed the entire air war flowed through these facilities. Those bases were under real threat. Sappers probed defense lines. Sniper attacks hit housing areas. Following direct attacks on several installations in 1968, American commanders requested and received permission to apply herbicides along the base perimeter fences, to kill the vegetation that gave attackers cover, to create clear sight lines, to make the ground around the base impossible to approach without being seen. The same logic that drove operations in Korea and Vietnam applied to the same problem. The chemicals used came from the same supply chain as Operation Ranch Hand. The Air Force program spraying millions of gallons of herbicide over Vietnamese jungle from C-123 cargo planes. And Ranch Hand aircraft weren't just passing through Thailand. They flew missions from Thai bases. C-123s launched from Udon, Uban, Nakhon Phanom, and Takli on defoliation sorties targeting Laotian vegetation and trails along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. When those planes came back, they were contaminated. The ramps where they parked were contaminated. The mechanics and flight line crews who maintained them came into contact with residue every time they showed up for their shift. Studies done decades later found that even the retired C-123s that came back to the United States after the spraying missions ended, planes that subsequently flew cargo and medevac missions domestically, still had Agent Orange residue on their interior surfaces. Air Force reservists who worked on those planes stateside in the 1970s were eventually recognized as having significant exposure from the contaminated fuselages alone. The men in Thailand, working on those same aircraft at the source bases, were in a worse position, not a better one. The Army's own field manual warned that herbicide drift from ground spraying operations could travel 500 meters from the spray site. At Korean Air Force Base, the NCO club was inside that zone. So were the physical training facilities. So were the softball fields. Living quarters were within meters of the fence line, being regularly soaked in herbicide. Those weren't men walking through jungle. They were people who ate breakfast and ran PT inside the contamination zone, and not one of them knew it. When they came back home sick, the VA told them it didn't count. Let me stay here a moment because the diseases matter. Agent Orange doesn't announce itself. You don't know you've been exposed until years later, sometimes a decade, sometimes 2, when something starts going wrong in ways your doctor can't easily explain. The contaminating agent in Agent Orange is dioxin, one of the most toxic synthetic compounds ever made. It accumulates in body fat, it persists for years, and it disrupts cellular processes in ways that eventually show up as cancer, nerve damage, or organ failure, often far from the original exposure. The VA's own list of diseases presumptively linked to Agent Orange is long: non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, multiple myeloma, prostate cancer, bladder cancer, ischemic heart disease, Parkinson's disease, soft tissue sarcomas, respiratory cancers. It includes peripheral neuropathy, the burning and numbness that starts in the hands and feet, the sensation that the ground isn't quite solid under you, that your extremities don't fully belong to your body anymore. Type 2 diabetes, a dozen others. And it's not only the veterans themselves. The children of men heavily exposed to Agent Orange show elevated rates of spina bifida and certain other birth defects. Steve House developed diabetes and neuropathy, both of them on that presumptive list. His feet hurt in ways he couldn't explain for years. Richard Kramer, one of the other Camp Carroll veterans, said his feet went numb while he was burying the barrels. He spent 2 months in a military hospital immediately afterward and never fully recovered. When these veterans filed claims with the VA, that's what they were presenting: documented diagnoses that matched the Agent Orange profile exactly, military service records showing where they'd served, and the straightforward request that the government acknowledge the connection. The disease matched. The service location matched. What didn't match, according to the VA, was the paperwork. Here's how the denial worked. For Thailand veterans, the argument was definitional. The herbicides used at Thai base perimeters were commercial products, not the tactical military formulations that carried the official Agent Orange presumption. Therefore, even with the documented cancer matching the Agent Orange profile, you couldn't establish service connection without proving your specific duties had placed you near the perimeter fence. Military police and security dog handlers had the clearest path, because their patrol assignments could be verified. Everyone else had to find the evidence wherever it happened to exist. For Korean DMZ veterans, the VA drew its acknowledgement window as narrow as it could justify. Benefits went to veterans who'd served in specific listed units at specific locations within a date range from April 1, 1968 to August 31, 1971. Veterans who'd served before the April 1968 cutoff, men who'd been in Korea in 1967 or earlier, were outside the window. The VA didn't say those men hadn't been exposed. It said it couldn't confirm their exposure fell within the required time frame. That distinction might sound academic. It isn't. Service-connected is the difference between affordable medical care and personal bankruptcy, between a disability rating that helps your family survive after you're gone and nothing at all. For a veteran in his 60s with cancer and a fixed income, the gap between those two outcomes is everything. David Benbow, the veteran turned attorney who'd served as a 2nd Infantry Division sergeant on that same DMZ strip in 1968 and 1969, spent years driving the public campaign to get these men recognized. He watched veterans die while the VA held its dateline. Men who'd walked the exact same cleared ground, whose bodies told the exact same story, were told they'd served 6 months too early. The system didn't dispute what had happened to them. It simply refused to connect it to where they'd served. Project Checo, a declassified Air Force records program from the Vietnam era, contained reports that confirmed herbicide use inside Thai base perimeters. Veterans pointed to those documents for years. As recently as 2012, VA adjudicators were citing those exact reports in denial letters, acknowledging the herbicides existed, then arguing the documentation still didn't prove tactical herbicide use, so no presumption applied. Two words that meant the same thing to a man with cancer and meant something different to a bureaucrat with a form to fill out. Building an individual Thailand claim could take years of work most sick veterans didn't have. One widow, her husband had died of lung cancer after service at Carroll Thai Air Force Base, spent years filing and refiling after his claim had been denied. Her attorneys went through his entire personnel file and found a supervisor's comment noting that he coached the base softball team. They found a map of Korean Air Force Base showing the location of the softball fields. Those fields were inside the herbicide drift zone, right against the perimeter fence. The VA board agreed. Service connection established. She received years of back pay. A coach mentioned in a performance review a map that happened to survive in an archive. For every widow who found those two documents, how many didn't? For every veteran who kept fighting year after year, how many ran out of time? In May 2011, Steve House drove to a Phoenix television station and told his story on camera. He was 54 years old, sick with a diabetes and neuropathy that had been eating at him for years. 33 years removed from Camp Carroll. He described the trench. He described Voodoo land. He described the drums, the green barrels with yellow and orange markings labeled Province of Vietnam, Compound Orange, some of them already seeping when he put them in the ground. A second veteran, Robert Travis, confirmed the account, describing how he'd wheeled the barrels out of the warehouse on forklifts. Travis told a reporter the stuff was seeping through the barrels, and the smell, he couldn't even finish describing the smell. A third veteran, Richard Kramer of Illinois, described his feet going numb while he handled the barrels. The 2 months in a military hospital that followed, the chronic arthritis and hearing loss that had stayed with him ever since. House told the Associated Press, "This is a burden I've carried around for 35 years. I just recently found out I have to have some major surgery. If I'm going to check out, I want to do it with a clean slate." In South Korea, the story hit like a shockwave. Overnight, it was front-page news. Citizens in the Chilgok region near Camp Carroll started asking questions about the groundwater, about the river running downstream, about what 30 years of buried contamination might have moved through the soil toward their wells. Politicians demanded answers from both governments. Within weeks, a joint U.S.-South Korean investigation team was running ground-penetrating radar surveys and soil samples over the location House had identified. They found something. A burial site 83 feet long, 46 feet wide, and 20 feet deep, containing high concentrations of perchloroethylene, a carcinogenic industrial solvent, alongside heavy metals, pesticide residue, and components of dioxin. The Army acknowledged that pesticides, herbicides, and other toxic compounds had been buried at Camp Carroll. It acknowledged that about 60 tons of contaminated soil had been excavated at some earlier point, and that its records didn't show where that removed soil had gone. After 8 months of investigation, the joint team announced it had found no Agent Orange specifically on the site. House's VA appeal was heard by a judge who went through the Army's investigation findings in detail. The investigation had confirmed that drums of pesticides, herbicides, and solvents were buried exactly where House had described in 1978, in the location he'd identified. The judge found his testimony credible and granted service connection. Whether the Army's specific conclusion about what wasn't in those drums should carry the same weight as its conclusion about what was, that's a judgment each person will have to make for themselves. The Camp Carroll story drew attention to a fight that Korea veterans had been waging in relative obscurity for more than 2 decades. It was Richard Morrow, a former 2nd Infantry Division soldier who'd walked the DMZ in the early 1970s and come home with the classic Agent Orange symptom profile, who first pushed for the classified documents to be released. He spent years demanding records, contacting government offices, refusing to be told the evidence didn't exist. In 1989, 21 years after the spraying started, a Veterans Service Director in Ohio named Denver Combs published newly declassified material in a newspaper column confirming Agent Orange had been applied in Korea as early as 1968, with over 12,000 American men in the exposure zone. David Benbow picked that evidence up and ran with it, estimating that across the full period of exposure, with nearly 100% annual turnover in the units serving that border, the total number of affected veterans ran well into the tens of thousands. 43 years after the spraying started, in 2011, the VA published a final rule moving the Korea recognition window back to September 1, 1967. A 7-month expansion that opened benefits to roughly 1,500 more veterans who'd been excluded. 4 decades to move a deadline 7 months. For Thailand, the commercial versus tactical wall held until Congress knocked it down. In August 2022, President Biden signed the Honoring Our PACT Act into law, the largest expansion of veterans' toxic exposure benefits in U.S. history, named for Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson, an Ohio National Guardsman who died of a rare cancer linked to burn pit exposure during his deployments. Among the PACT Act's most significant changes, Thailand was added to the Agent Orange presumptive list, covering any veteran who served at any U.S. or Royal Thai military base between January 9, 1962 and June 30, 1976. No more duty position requirements. No more commercial versus tactical. Done. The law added 5 new presumptive locations in total: Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Guam, Johnston Atoll. Every theater where the U.S. military had used or stored these chemicals, and then spent years treating the resulting claims with maximum skepticism. Veterans who'd been denied could refile. Surviving families could pursue back pay the old system had permanently closed off. It was right, and it was 60 years late. The diseases that dioxin causes don't expire when the law catches up. The men who died before 2022, who died before 2011, who paid out of pocket for care the government should have covered, whose families never saw the compensation they were owed, none of that gets corrected retroactively. What the PACT Act did was stop new harm from accumulating. The old harm stands. Steve House came forward because he was sick and running out of time. He said so directly. He'd carried this for 35 years, and he didn't want to die still carrying it. He wanted the record to reflect what he'd seen with his own eyes. That those drums were real, the labels were real, the orders were real, and that the men who'd followed those orders deserved to have that in the record before they were gone. The men who walked the cleared Korean hillside in 1968 served in a shooting war their government refused to name. They came home to a benefit system that kept classified the very documents they'd need to make their case, and then required them to reconstruct that evidence piece by piece, in their own declining health, often without lawyers or advocates who understood what they were fighting. The Air Force veterans at Udorn and Korat and Nakham Phanom, the mechanics, the security police, the intelligence analysts, the men who coached softball teams, spent years being told the chemicals soaking their base perimeters didn't count. The number of veterans affected in Korea and Thailand alone, separate from Vietnam, runs into the tens of thousands. How many died before 2022, before 2011, before any of the recognition came? That's not a figure anyone is counting. What the record shows is this. The U.S. military used toxic herbicides in at least 3 separate theaters. It had the documents. It kept those documents classified when they became inconvenient. And when the people who served in those places came home sick and asked for help, it spent the better part of 60 years finding reasons to say no. That's not a bureaucratic accident. It's a pattern. And the way to understand any pattern is to ask who it benefited and who it cost. I'm Dave. Thanks for watching. If this kind of history matters to you, hit subscribe, leave a comment, drop a name, a story, something from your family's service history that you think needs a video. And I'll see you in the next one.
Oh, Dave.